Today we're going to be learning Rosh Hashanah Daf Chet. This week of learning is sponsored by Beth Hyatt in memory of Dr. Chaya Gorsitman, a lifelong learner and gifted educator who inspired me to start learning the Daf at the beginning of this cycle. Today's Daf is sponsored by Adina and Mark Haber for Refuah Shlema for their son Yair Amitai ben Adina Rachel, who's undergoing a medical procedure today. Batzlacha. And anonymously in honor of the Yurtzad of Rachel Imenu, Rachel Bat Lavan. Okay, we're going to get started now with we'll just go back briefly to the end of yesterday's daf. So we're going through different parts of the Mishnah of all the different Rosh Hashanah one by one. So the one we got up to yesterday's daf was Echa Be'elul Rosh Hashanah L'Maaser Behema, which was only Rabbi Meir's opinion. Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Elazar disagree. So then we said, okay, well, the Mishnah, we didn't know it was Rabbi Meir's opinion, but the Gemara tells us it's Rabbi Meir. They prove it from a Braita. And then they talk about how the order's a little bit strange, and then they talk about how the numbers don't exactly work out. So, well, the numbers are either Rabbi Shimon has 4 Rosh Hashanah and Rabbi Meir has 4 Rosh Hashanah, or it's 4 Rosh Hashanah by months, because remember, Rabbi Shimon splits. The Regalim is really the 15th of Nisan and the 1st of Nisan, but those are really counted as one if you hold that we're only counting months and we're not counting how many dates we have for Rosh Hashanah. So then the Gemara said, but wait, according to whatever explanation we take, we have another problem, because it says in another Braita that there's 2 more Rosh Hashanah. Where do those appear? Right? So it would be 1 extra if you go by months, because one of them is going to be in Nisan, and 2 extra if you go by dates. And we have here the 16th of Nisan is Rosh Hashanah for the Omer, and the 6th of Sivan is the Rosh Hashanah for the Shtei Alechem. Again, I'll repeat this because this is important stuff that's going to come up much later in Shas, but this idea that the 16th of Nisan is the day that permits eating the new wheat, or the new crop. Until then, you can't eat from the new crop. And the day that we bring the Shtei Alechem permits it on the altar, because the new crop is not permitted on the altar until you bring the Shtei Alechem korban. So now the Gemara brings 3 answers. We were in the middle of the second one when we stopped our daf yesterday. So let's just go through the answers. One is something that doesn't start at night. Aren't mentioned in the list. In other words, again, it's a question of why the person who put together the Mishnah, assuming Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, he edited it. Why didn't he include these? Because he was only including things that start already at night. So, right, these start in the day when you bring the Korban HaOmer, when you bring the Shtei Alechem. That's when it kicks in. So then we said, well, what about Baal Ta'acher, right? That also can only happen during the day because you can't bring sacrifices until daytime. But they say, no. Really, Baal Ta'acher kicks in, I want to clarify, really kicks in from when you took the vow. Already, your obligation to bring it hits in right there, and therefore, it's already from before. Same answer, right? And then we said, what about Yovel? Yovel seems, and we're going to get to this machloket about Yovel later today. Machloket between Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka and the rabbis. Does Yovel start when you blow the shofar on Yom Kippur of the 50th year, which we'll see in the verses later today? Or does it kick in on Rosh Hashanah? So if you hold it kicks in on the 10th day, then also something that kicks in during the day when you blow the shofar on Yom Kippur. So that would then, why is it mentioned in the Mishnah? Oh, the Mishnah must hold like Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, who holds that Yovel kicks in really from Rosh Hashanah. Okay, then we had the same exact structure by the next answer. The second answer was, so we resolved the first answer, and we bring another answer. Second answer is, it's all things that are not dependent on actions, whereas Omer and Shtei Alechem are dependent on action. It's only permitted once you bring a sacrifice. Then they say, wait, but also Baal Ta'acher, you can't bring your sacrifice on whatever day you're supposed to bring it until the korban in the morning was brought. Oh, again, we're going to say, right, really, the obligation kicks in when you take the vow, and therefore it's not dependent really on an action. So now we're up to question number 2, which is the exact same question that we had on answer number 1, which was Harei Yovelot. We're starting now on our daf Chet. Rabbi Shmuel, right? Yovel also depends on blowing the shofar. It's an action that causes it, and yet it's still in our Mishnah. So if you're saying our Mishnah doesn't mention anything that's dependent on action, well, this shouldn't be mentioned either. So again, the same answer, Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. It follows his opinion, who says that it doesn't depend on any action. Yovel starts from Rosh Hashanah of the Jubilee year. Again, Yovel will deal with all later today's daf. We'll understand this all much more. Rav Ashi Amar, third answer. Here's just a different way of counting. Instead of saying our Mishnah decided to mention these and didn't mention those, well, our Mishnah only mentions Arba'a Rashi Shanim, Shehem Ba'arba Rashi Chodashim. It's only mentioning days, Rosh Hashanah, that start on the first of the month. And they're not mentioning, right? Echad b'Tishrei, Echad b'Elul, Echad b'Nisan, I'm not going in order, and Echad b'Shvat. So it only mentions things that start on the first day of the year, of the month. Therefore, the 16th of Nisan, the Sivan one, right, aren't mentioned. Okay, you have a bit of a problem according to Rabbi Shimon. What about he said, right, the Regalim or the 15th? But okay, that's a bit of a question. So the Gemara asks a different question, which is a better question, which is Be'echad b'Shvat k'Beit Shammai. But wait, the first of Shvat is only Beit Shammai's opinion. It's the first of Shvat. Beit Hillel says the 15th. And don't we normally hold like Beit Hillel? So to say that the Tan of our Mishnah is putting things that are only the first of the month doesn't really work. So they say, well, it's Shlosha l'divrei hakol, and Be'echad b'Shvat machloket Beit Shammai u'Beit Hillel. It's right 3 according to everyone, and it'll be 4 if you hold like Beit Shammai. Okay, that's a weak answer, and it's a weak answer also for the reason I said, because we already said that the Regalim is really from the 15th of Nisan, so then it's mentioning that one as well. So it's a bit of a weak answer, but we have these 3 possible answers as to why those other things weren't mentioned here. Now we're moving on to the next line, which also has to deal with the animal tithes, but it's going to be the second opinion. So remember, Rabbi Meir, we're now going to get into what's the root of the debate. First of Elul, first of Tishrei, why? Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, Omrim be'echad b'Tishrei. So now we're going to have Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Shnehem mikra achad darshu. They both learned it from one verse. We're going to see what's going to happen in the structure is Rabbi Yochanan is going to prove it from one verse and say Rabbi Meir learns it this way. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon learned it a different way. The Gemara is going to eventually reject that. We're going to bring a different answer, which is again to say that they both learned it out from the same verse, just differently. So either way, they're going to both learn it from the same place. Just each one comes with it out with a different conclusion. So, well, let's see Rabbi Yochanan. First, Ushnehem mikra achad darshu. So they both learned it from this verse. It's a verse in Tehillim, okay, Psalms, which talks about the time of year that the sheep become impregnated. Shene'ema, lavshu karim hatzon. Okay, lavshu karim hatzon means that the tzon wore a cover, something. Okay, what they're going to all understand is that however you explain this, but I'll give you a few different ways of possibly understanding it. It means this is when they become pregnant. So either they're wearing something additional, meaning they're pregnant, or their mates mate with them, almost like there's something additional on them, which is the mating process. Or maybe it's talking about the fetus or the embryo is surrounded by, protected by clothing of the tzon itself. Different ways of understanding it. Either which way, it clearly refers to the animal becoming impregnated. So now the idea is, lavshu karim atzon, what is the season that this happens in? Well, va'amakim yatfu bar, when the valleys are filled with grain, yitroa'u af yashiru, and they will make yitroa'u from the language of tru'ah, like a shofar sounding noise, and they'll even be singing. Okay, now we're going to talk about what this means. So Rabbi Meir Saval, he holds, matai lavshu karim atzon, when do they become pregnant? Bizman sha'amakim yatfu bar, when the valleys start to fill up with grain. When is that? We were talking about this before, right? They start to grow in Adar, and then they're fully grown, right? They grow more in Nisan. So when is that? That's in Adar. Mitabrot ba'Adar. Now, if they become pregnant in Adar, Yoldot ba'Av, then they give birth in Av. Okay, so now, why that? Because there's an assumption, and we'll see this also later in Shas, that 5 months is the time in which, right, like where normally our gestation period is 9 months. For small animals, it's 5 months. So 5 months, that gets you to Av. Therefore, most of them are born in Av. Therefore, Rosh Hashanah shalahem Elul. So therefore, we're going to do the Rosh Hashanah for the Maaser Behema exactly in Elul. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon Omrim, no, we understand it differently. Remember, they get to Tishrei. How do they get to Tishrei? Matai lavshu karim atzon, bizman she'itroa'u af yashiru. They darshan the latter part of the pasuk. It's when they're already singing. Now, when is that? So when they're already hard and they start to make some noises, when they move, they're much fuller. That's going to be in Nisan. V'yodot be'elul. Mitabrot b'Nisan, v'yodot be'elul. Right? So then Nisan, count 5 months, you get to Elul. Rosh Hashanah shalahem Tishrei, and therefore the Rosh Hashanah is Tishrei. So it's all a matter of, do you darshan it from the first part of the pasuk or the second part? So now obviously we're going to have to deal with each opinion. What do they do with the other 3 words that they didn't use in their drasha? Because everyone agrees that amakim yatfu bal, it starts to be full of tfu'ah in Adar. Then in Nisan, it becomes very full. So now they say, okay, so the idach nami, what does the other one do with haktiv yitra u'af yashiru? What does he do with that M part of the pasuk? Rabbi Meir. So they say, ahuba aflata. Oh, those are for the ones. Yeah, yitra u'af yashiru is the later stage. Yes, there's a few who become pregnant later, but the majority become pregnant earlier, and therefore it's the earlier date. And then it's just saying there's other ones. We saw the word afilah just in the daf or 2 before, which was talking about how when things grow late. So here, either it's referring to the grains that grow late, or it's referring to the sheep that become pregnant late. Either which way, it's saying those are the later ones, but that's not the important ones. That's in Nisan. V'idach nami, the other opinion, right, who says we're darshaning the latter part of the verse, haktiv amakim yatfu bal. What about the fact that they fill up already in Adar? They start filling up. How about b'charfiyata? Those are the ones that are charifim. They're quick. Okay, they're quick to become pregnant or quick to grow, whether it's referring to the grains or the animals, to atya me'adar, that come earlier, but that's not the ones that are important. Okay, it's a matter of, right, do we go by Nisan or Adar? Everyone agrees there's Adar and there's Nisan, that for sure. The question is, when it says, right, yatfu karim atzon, we're going to determine the tides based on that. Are we determining it by the beginning part or the latter part of the verse? And by the main, or, right, there's always the ones who are earlier, the ones who are later. Okay. So now they say, wait, but if you really look back at this, and here's going to come the rejection of Rabbi Yochanan. The order of the verse is which means, right, they become pregnant when the grains start to grow in Adar. So therefore, in other words, the order of the pasuk is like that. And then ikanami, right? Then there's also, yitro af yashiu. That's at the end of the verse. Okay, and some are a little bit later, but we're going to go by the majority. But Elul, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, who say the main is the latter part of the verse, then Ibcha B'Baile, it should have said, Lavshu karim ason bizman sheyitro af yashiru. The latter part should have come earlier. That's the main part. The later, right? The later date is the main part. The Kanami, and there's some Damakim Yatfubar who will even get pregnant earlier. But those are less significant. So the order of the pasuk doesn't match Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon's opinion at all. So therefore, we're going to reject Rabbi Yochanan because it's really hard to say that that's how they read the verse. So therefore, we're going to have a different explanation. Ela amarav. Dekule alma lavshu karim atzon bizman shamakim yatfubar ba'adar. Therefore, it's interesting. They're having a machloket about the reality, right? But so in the end, they're going to say it's really not a machloket about the reality, about when do they actually become pregnant. Most of them really become pregnant in Adar, which would then bring us to Av, which would then bring us to the Rosh Hashanah should really be Elul, which is Rabbi Meir. But what's the machloket between them? They actually have a machloket about a totally different pasuk. And instead of quoting a pasuk from Tehillim, they're going to quote a pasuk from the Torah. Okay, here's our pasuk. Aser ta'aser, which is, right, you should bring your masrot. There it's talking about the grains, okay? Aser ta'aser is kol tfu'at zaracha yotzei sadeh shana shana. Okay, you should take the grains that come out of your fields every year. So now it says, why does it say aser ta'aser? It just could have said aser, take ma'aser. Why does it say double language? It's to teach you b'shnei ma'asrot ha'katuv medaber. The verse is referring to two ma'asrot, and they're going to then make a comparison between them. Echad ma'aser behema ve'echad ma'aser dagan. One is animal tithes, and one is the one for the grains. Rabbi Meir savar makish ma'aser behema le'ma'aser dagan. So they're both going to say this. It's just a matter of what element or how do you do the comparison. So he's going to say, we compare. How do we compare? Ma ma'aser dagan samuch l'gemaro isuro. This is like an analogy. Ma'aser dagan, when are you obligated in Maaser? When it's ready, right? Samuch ligmaro, as soon as it's ready, Right? Remember, there has to be Gemar Malacha, right? It has to be finished, ripe. That's when you take it. Af Maser Behema, Samuch Ligmaro, Isuro. Now, when is Samuch Ligmaro? What did we just say? Happens in Av that they're mostly born. So if most of them everyone agrees they're mostly born in Av because they're mostly become pregnant in Adar. Therefore, they mostly become born. They're mostly born in Av. Therefore, we're going to do it as close to the time of it, so that, right, quote unquote, ripening, okay, the way the grains are. So since the grains, it's going to be Tishrei, right, because that's when they're most ripened. But when it comes to right, that's when we start the Shana for Maser Dagan. But when it comes to the Maser Behema, we're going to do it in Elul because that's the time that it's closest to when it's ripened or ready, right, at born in this case. But Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Savle, Makish Maser Behema Maser Dagan. Maybe you can already figure out where they're going. Ma Maser Dagan Rosh Hashanah Shelo Tishrei, Af Maser Behema Rosh Hashanah Shelo Tishrei. We're going to compare them for the actual date. We're going to say the date for that is the same as the date for this. So since the date for that is Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, the date for this is also Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, right, or first of Tishrei. So therefore, are we going to compare it in reality or conceptually? Right? Rabbi Meir says compare it conceptually. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon say compare it actually. Okay, so they both learned it from a Hekesh. It's just a different Hekesh. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next one. Okay, we finished. So that was Maser Behema. We dealt with it in two platforms, right? First, we tried to say, who's the opinion? Then we said Rabbi Yehuda Nasi basically takes some of Rabbi Shimon, some of Rabbi Meir. And then we said, so how does the number 4 work out? From that, we got to 2 answers. From that, we got to a whole bunch of questions on it. Why not 5? Why not 6? And then we answered those. We had 3 possible answers. We had questions on each of those answers, but we resolved them. Then we moved on to the root of the machloket between the 2 of them. Is it based on this pasuk of Shukarim Atzon from Tehillim, to which we rejected Rabbi Yochanan, and we brought in Rava, who says, no, it's really about this Hakesh to Maser Dagan. That's a summary of what we've done until now. Now we're moving on to the next date. Rosh Hashanah Leshanim. So what does it mean, Rosh Hashanah Leshanim? We're going to eventually see 3 different answers. We'll start with the first. It's for documents. This is going to sound familiar, right? Documents. Why? Ditnan, as it says in the Mishnah. If you have a document that has the wrong date on it, if it's a later date from the time it actually happened, that's fine. But if it's an earlier date, it's a problem. Remember, we talked about if you have a loan and you have a document about it, then the person, the creditor can go to take it from land that you sold from the date of the loan. So if you write an earlier date, he can demand it from people who you sold land to before the actual loan happened. And that's not true. You can't do that, right? That's illegal because it's only after the loan took place. And that way, whoever buys land from you should check into it. Do you owe any money? And if you do, they know that someone might demand it from them. And therefore, if the loan hadn't actually happened and just you wrote a loan at a later date and predated it, then they'll take land from him unfairly. So that's why a shtar mukdam isn't good. A shtar mu'uchar is fine because it doesn't really matter if you put a later date. So, you'll be messed up, the creditor, but you obviously wrote the document and you didn't care to sign it with a late date. So it's your issue. And therefore you need to know. So therefore we're telling you the years, if you need to know what the date is, if it's this year, that year, and you need to make sure, is it early? Is it not? Then you need to know, how do we count Shanim from the 1st of Tishrei? What's the obvious problem? We already said Rosh Hashanah LeMelachim is the 1st of Nisan. And that one we said, right, is for Shtarot. So obviously we have an issue here. V'hatnan, but wait, doesn't say in the Mishnah. And he explained the exact same thing. That's how we knew exactly what this meant, because we already learned it. So how could you say it's Rosh Hashanah Nisan? How could you say it's Rosh Hashanah Tishrei? This we already learned. What's the answer? Lo kasha, kan l'malchei Yisrael, kan l'malchei umat ha'olam. Rosh Hashanah Nisan is how we count when it's a Jewish king. We had a whole discussion, remember, with Daryavish and this, and was he right counted by the Jewish kings and also counted by the non-Jewish kings, right? And this one is telling you Rosh Hashanah for Gentile kings. Okay. Now the Gemara says, but wait, that doesn't really make sense that the Mishnah actually says this explicitly. We're not going to disagree that that's the case, but it doesn't make sense. This is what our Mishnah means. Why? Because if you remember back on the bottom of Gimel Amud Aleph, Amar Rav Chisda, Elahada Amar Rav Chisda. But wait, but when Rav Chisda said, Loshanu ela l'machei Yisrael, aval l'machei umat ha'olam mitishrei manina. Remember, Rav Chisda came and said, that's how we got into this whole discussion. He said, that Rosh Hashanah of Nisan, this is a good review. That Rosh Hashanah of Nisan was just for the Jewish kings. But when it comes to kings from other nations, we count by the first of Tishrei. Now, if you want to say that that's what our Mishnah says, Rav Chisda is an Amora. He lived after the time of the Mishnah. You're going to say, Rav Chisda manitin talash minan. He's just trying to tell us a Mishnah. The Mishnah says it, right? He should have just said, the Mishnah says, Rosh Hashanah Leshanim, and that's Machei Umot Olam. He shouldn't say, oh, I'm telling you that the Mishnah was referring to, when it said Chab Nisan, it was referring to Jewish kings. But all other kings go by Chab Tishrei. When the Mishnah explicitly says that, Chab Tishrei Leshanim, we assume is Machei Umot Olam. It says it in the Mishnah. And Moraim don't come to say things it says in the Mishnah unless they quote the Mishnah. Then it makes sense. But they don't, even that, they don't need to quote a Mishnah. We know the Mishnah, right? There's this assumption. If everybody knows it, there's no reason to state. So now they say, no. If you look back at Rav Chisda, now I want to read before we read inside. If you go back to Gimel Amud Aleph for a brief minute, we had there, Amar Rav Chisda, okay, I'm a few lines from the bottom of the page. Lo shanu ela l'machei Yisrael, aval machei umot ha'olam mitishrei manina. That's so far what we quoted, right? The Mishnah, the first line of the Mishnah was only, when it said Lemelachim, Chab Nisan, it was only referring to Jewish kings, not other kings. Shene'emar. And then he said, as it says in the verse, and then he brings these verses from Nehemiah, remember with the 20th year of Artashshasta, and there was this issue, and then he says, this had to be Rosh Hashanah of Tishrei. So he quotes it from a pasuk. So now the Gemara says, to prove it, so the Gemara says, Rav Chisda wasn't trying to teach us a halacha that the Mishnah states. What was Rav Chisda trying to do? Look, Rav Chisda cry atalash minan. He was stating the Mishnah. What it says explicitly in the Mishnah, the reason he brought it wasn't to say a halacha that the Mishnah stated. What he was trying to say is, I'm going to show you where the Mishnah gets it from verses in the Ketuvim, okay, in Nehemiah. So his whole point wasn't to teach you that there's this distinction, Machei Yisrael, Machei Umot Ha'olam, that we know. What he was trying to tell you is, I will prove it from a pasuk. That was his chiddush. That's one way of understanding it. Alternatively, you could say, Ibait Ema, Rav Chisda ke Rabbi Zera matnena. As I said before, we're going to see three different interpretations of Leshanim. He went with Rabbi Zera, who said that it really means Leshanim is Litkufa. What does Litkufa mean? It means for the seasons. We count the seasons from Nisan, from Tishrei, and Rabbi, actually didn't check if it's Rabbi Eliezer or Rabbi Elazar. Someone could check and tell me. But Rabbi Eliezer, let's assume, okay, to Amar b'Tishrei nivra ha'olam. I think it's Rabbi Eliezer. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But it's Rabbi Eliezer who says, b'Tishrei nivra ha'olam, the world was created in Tishrei. We're going to see this later. There's a big debate. Was the world created in Tishrei or was the world created in Nisan? Okay, we usually say Tishrei. That's why we hold like Tishrei. Thank you, Ruth, for telling me it's Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer is the one who holds that it's Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. That's when the world was created, on the first of Tishrei, which really means that man was created on the first of Tishrei. Really, it started in Kapei Be'elul. We'll get to all this later. But the point is that Rabbi Zera said, we hold like Rabbi Eliezer, and therefore when we count the seasons, now, big question what exactly the relevance of this is, but when we count the seasons, we start with, right, if you're talking about the 4 seasons of the year and the way the constellations move, we're basically, it starts from Tishrei. Okay, the first one that happened in the world was from Tishrei, and that's always considered the first. Okay, so that's what he says. Rosh Achab Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah L'Tkufa, which means that it doesn't teach us what Rav Chisda taught us, right? It doesn't teach us about these documents of the Gentile kings, which means that when Rav Chisda said it, it makes perfect sense because it didn't say so in the Mishnah. So it could be that Rav Chisda held like Rabbi Zera, but that's what this Mishnah was telling us. So we now already, even though we were really just focusing on the first interpretation, we've already gotten a second interpretation. That it could be it's for documents and it's Gentile kings, or Rav Chisda seemingly could hold like Rabbi Zera, and Rabbi Zera holds it's Litkufa. Okay, third opinion. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar Lidin. Chab Tishrei Rosh Hashanah Leshanim, for years, right? You can see already why this word Leshanim, it was a poor choice of words, because for years, what years can mean anything, basically. And that's really what they're doing here. They're saying, oh yeah, it can mean for all sorts of things. He understands it for judgment. As we know, right? Where do we know this from? It doesn't say in the Torah that Rosh Hashanah is Yom Hadin. It's the day of judgment. It comes from here and other sources that talk about that Rosh Hashanah is the day of judgment where God judges us for the entire year. What's the entire year? From Rosh Hashanah to the end of the year. So there you have it. It's Ladin. Tichtiv, Mereshit Hashanah va'ad Acharit Hashanah. They prove it from a verse in Dvarim, which we saw the other day, which now will resolve a question that we had the other day, which is, when we quoted it last time, it was obvious to them that Reshit Hashanah means Tishrei. Not so clear why that would be obvious. Here we're going to actually ask the question, how do you know that this is referring to Tishrei? And then they're going to prove it, okay, which we didn't have in the Sugya the other day. So here it's a pasuk in Sefer Dvarim, which talks about a very famous pasuk where it talks about the difference between Egypt and Israel in terms of rain, right? That we're dependent on God for rain. And it says, Eretz asher Hashem Elokecha doresh ota tamid enei Hashem Elokecha ba, right? The eyes of God are always on the land because, right, we need rain and therefore God is always helping us. Mereshit Hashanah va'ad Acharit Hashanah, meaning we're dependent on God. We can't live independently here. We have to beseech God for rain, right? It's good theme to be discussing now while we're starting to ask for rain. The rainy season is beginning. So there you have it. From the beginning of the year to the end of the year. So therefore, God must be also judging us, right? He judges us from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. Will he give us rain? Will it be a good year, etc.? The way they darshan this, from the beginning of the year, it will be ruled what will be at the end of the year. So now they say, Mimai de Tishrei, how do you know that this is Tishrei? As I said, we said this the other day as if obviously this is Tishrei. How do we know? This could be Nisan, right? Could be anything theoretically if we go back to all our crazy discussions about maybe Iyar, maybe Sivan, maybe Adar, but probably either Nisan or Tishrei. So how do they know? Well, Dichtiv. Now they quote a different verse from Tehillim, and this is also a famous pasuk because we quote it. We say it in Kiddush on Rosh Hashanah. It's a pasuk we always say refers to Rosh Hashanah, and you're going to see it here. Tik'u b'chodesh shofar b'kesel liyom chagenu. Blow on the month the shofar. B'kesel liyom chagenu. Okay, which the pshat doesn't really mean this, but the way they're going to understand this is when it's covered on the day of our holiday. Okay, so what does it mean when it's covered? When the moon is covered, the chodesh, right? The chodesh is the new moon. How, right? What ezehu chag? What month is it? What holiday is it? Sha'chodesh mitkasebo. That the holiday, the moon is covered. Okay, there's different interpretations. What exactly is covered? Some people say that it means the moon is covered because, right, new moon, you don't really see the moon. There's only one holiday that falls on the first of the month. And that's Rosh Hashanah. That's one way to understand it. Another way is to say the holiday of Rosh Chodesh is covered because we celebrate Rosh Hashanah. We kind of don't talk about Rosh Chodesh at all. So it's the one month where Rosh Chodesh isn't really mentioned and only Rosh Hashanah. Some people say the Seirizim, which is you bring a Seirizim for Chatat, a goat for a Chatat, which you bring on all the holidays, but the one that you bring on Rosh Hashanah, it's not mentioned specifically on Rosh Hashanah in the Torah. So it's Korban is covered, right? The Rosh Hashanah Korban is covered because it's not mentioned, even though you do bring it. Anyway, there's different interpretations of what exactly this means. The usual is that it's really referring to the moon, that the moon is covered, you can't see the moon, and that's only Rosh Hashanah. What does that have to do with our pasuk, Reshit Hashanah, Acharit Hashanah, that God judges us? Doesn't really seem to have to do with it. So let's read. Uchtiv, the continuation of that pasuk is, Ki chok liYisrael hu mishpat leElohei Yaakov. It starts saying, because the rule is for Yisrael, the mishpat is for God, meaning, in other words, God judges us then. So here's the connection. This is a very famous pasuk because this is where we get that Rosh Hashanah is Yom Adin. Okay, it's really important to understand this. This idea of Rosh Hashanah being Yom Adin does not appear in the Torah. Okay, it's a Yom Tru'ah, Yom Zichron Tru'ah. Doesn't talk anything about judgment. That's a later addition. Comes from this interpretation of this pasuk, maybe from other places as well, but this is one of the main sources. So now so again, how did we get here? Well, we wanted to say it's Rosh Hashanah L'Din. You learn it from the fact that God's always watching us from Reshit Hashanah to Acharit Hashanah, which we understood to mean God is judging us from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. Then we said, how do we know that it's Rosh Hashanah? Because we have this other verses in Tehillim, which are connecting between Rosh Hashanah, which was pasuk number 1, to judgment, which is pasuk number 2 that we quoted, and they're right next to each other. So obviously it's connected because it says Ki chok Yisrael, right? This is a chok to Israel. Mishpat leElohei Yaakov, so it's connecting Rosh Hashanah to judgment. And that's how we resolved it. Since we already quoted this pasuk, we're going to now have 2 other drashot on this pasuk. Ki chok Yisrael, and to talk about judgment of God of the Jewish people. Now they want to darshan those two parts of the verse. It starts talking about the Jewish people, and then it talks about the God of the Jewish people, right? There's chok, right? It's one of these structures of this chok to Yisrael, there's mishpat Elohei Yaakov, right? So if you compare chok and mishpat are basically similar, right? Laws, different ways of saying laws. And Yisrael and Elohei Yaakov are obviously different. One is Israel, the Jewish people. One is God in general. It's true, he's the God of Jacob, but he's God in general. It doesn't really say anything about the Jewish people. So first we're going to compare Yisrael to God. Then we're going to compare Yisrael to the universal theme of God. Okay, so that God is God over all of the universe. That's going to be the second drasha. So if the first drasha says like this, Melamed she'ein beit din shel mala nichnesim ladin, ela im ken kidshu beit din shel mata et hachodesh. We're now going to say that the beit din shel mata, we have to determine its Rosh Chodesh first. We have to do what we like to say, hishtadlus, right? Our part. We have to make an effort to God to sanctify the month. Then God will convene his Beit Din up above to rule over us. Okay, so we have to do our share before God will do his share. That's why it starts with Israel and moves to God. That's the first drasha. The second is Tanya Idach, a different Braita says, Ki chok liYisrael hu, en li ela liYisrael. And it sounds like God just judges the Jewish people. How do we know he also judges the Gentiles in the state? Talmud Lamal, or in general maybe, Mishpat Elohei Yaakov. The second part, as I said, is universal. It's the Mishpat is for God. That means God for over everybody. So now they say, Im Kain, Matamud Omer Kechok Israel. So why does it start with Israel? And that's theoretically, if God judges everyone, we could have skipped Israel. We would have just said, Mishpat Elohei Yisrael. Okay, maybe it wouldn't have sounded so poetic, but that's not the way they learn these psukim, right? They want to say, it says both. What's it coming to tell you? Jews could have been included in the universal theme. If God judges everyone, he obviously judges us as well. So, Melamed Yisrael nechnesim tchila ladin, means we get judged first. Now they're going to compare this to something. Rav Chisda, as Rav Chisda says, the Amar Rav Chisda, Melech v'tzibor, Melech nichnas tchila ladin. If you have a king and a community, right, a lot of people, the masses, who's going to go first? The king. Why? We're going to give two different reasons. How do we know this? First of all, where do we get it from a verse? We get it from Shlomo HaMelech. When Shlomo HaMelech dedicated the temple, he gave a big speech and he said, this house is going to be in Melech HaMalef Perek Chet. This house is going to be for you for all sorts of things. And one of the things he says there is, Shenemar Mishpat Avdo Mishpat Amo. It's going to be a place for judgment of your servant, which is his way of saying myself, the King Shlomo, and Mishpat Amo, and the Mishpat of the people, my time. So that means I'm going to be judged first. After you'll judge the people. So now that's the pasuk where we prove it from. Now we're going to have two explanations. My time. What's the reason? One could say, it's not appropriate for the king to stand in the hall waiting, right? If you're going to have, this is clear, right? You have a hierarchy of who's going to come first, right? Sometimes we say first come, first serve, but if the king's standing there, we're going to obviously let the king come in first. It's not respectful. And so again, compare that to the Jews. If the Jews and the Gentiles are coming for judgment, so God's going to let us in first because we're his nation, and then everyone else is also his nation, but not the same. This is a very interesting answer. Before God gets angry, right? I think about sometimes by the end of the day, right? We lose our someone just described to me, someone the other day, they said, she's a great mom. And then at the end of the day, you see her in like a totally different light, screaming at her kids, getting angry, right? This happens to all of us really, right? But you're at the end of the day, your anger sometimes comes out much more when you're tired and you've had a full day, etc. It's not exactly what Rashi says. Rashi says something a little bit different, which I think could be explained this way, could be explained elsewhere. Some other way, obviously God isn't like that. This is just giving human characteristics to God, right? It's looking at God through our own eyes and our own experiences. It doesn't really mean God would do this. But what he says here is, God is judging the people all day. He's going to see all the sins of the people. He's going to get angry because he doesn't like when the people sin. And then, right, he'll take it out on the last person who comes to court, either that. Therefore, you don't want the king to be last. Alternatively, you could say, no, maybe, right? And that's more similar to what I said a little bit, which is, by the end of the day after, this is why he's already angry by the end of the day because of the Avonot Tzibur. Alternatively, you could say that Rashi is saying because of the Avonot Tzibur, if the king comes in the beginning of the day to be judged, God doesn't see all the punishments of everyone else, so the transgressions of everyone else, so he'll judge him as he sees it. But once he sees the people sinning all day long, he sees all this one and this one did that, he'll blame the king for it. It's really the king's responsibility that the people are so bad, because the king ultimately is responsible for the people. And then the king will get punished really for justified reasons. But again, we'd rather try to save the king from all the punishments. Okay, so those are different possible explanations. Either way, it's an analogy for the Jewish people that we get judged first, so that again, would it be because God's already, after seeing all the bad things that everyone else does, then we're going to end up, bearing the brunt of God's anger? Or that maybe also we're supposed to be Or Lagoyim, we're supposed to positively influence, and if they're behaving in that way, then it's reflective on us, and we are somewhat responsible for that. So different ways of understanding this. Okay, moving on to Shemitah, which is nice. This is what we're in this year. Minalan dichtiv. How do we know Shnata Shemitah starts on Rosh, on Achab Tishrei, on Rosh Hashanah? Dichtiv ubeshana shvi'it. Notice it says the year, 7th year. That's going to be the key word here. Shabbat Shabbaton yeh la'aretz, which describes, right, the land should rest. V'gamal shana mitishrei. Says shana there, and it says shana somewhere else, and one is Tishrei, the other one's Tishrei. Which one is that? As we saw earlier today, Dichtiv Mereshit Hashanah, from the beginning of the year. So you see Tishrei, beginning of the year. Okay, there we have it. Obviously, what's the problem? The last time we brought this up, if you remember, we had said we learned Shana from Nisan. Remember, we were counting months, and it said, right, there's Olat Chodesh B'Chodsho L'Chodshei Hashanah. And they said, we're going to learn it from Nisan. Why? Because by Nisan, it says, Rishon Hu Lachem L'Chodshei Hashanah. So Shana there was Nisan. Then we said, why don't we learn it from Reshit Hashanah? And they said, we're going to learn a month that has, right, a pasuk that has months and years from a pasuk that has months and years. So this is going to be the mirror image of that sugya, or reverse image of that sugya, however you want to say it. But now they're going to say, so Gamar Shana mi Tishrei, because it says Mereshit Hashanah, which we already proved is Tishrei. V'ligmor Shana mi Nisan. Why don't you learn from Nisan? Dichtiv Rishon Hu Lachem L'Chodshei Hashanah. There Shana appears, and Shana means Nisan. So the answer, Danim Shana she'eni machodeshim, Mishana she'eni machodeshim, Ve'en Danim Shana she'eni machodeshim, Mishana she'yeshi machodeshim. Here we have Shana without months. So we're going to learn Shana without months from the place where Shana appears without months. We're not going to learn Shana without months from a place where it says Shana with months. And that's why we learned this one from Rosh Hashanah and that one from Tishrei, from Nisan. Okay. Next one, Yovlot. Okay, and we're going to end with this topic of Yovlot. We'll actually end in the middle of the topic of Yovlot. So now the Gemara says, right, Yovlot Echa B'Tishrei, right? Yovlot Echa B'Tishrei hu. What do you mean? Yovlot Asara B'Tishrei hu. As I said before, there's this big machloket. And it seems clear, it seems from the pshat of the psukim. Okay, I'll read you the psukim right now. Okay, if you can look up the sheet, I put them on the bottom of the sheet. Vayikra Kafhe, Pasuk Chet, we're going to start. V'safarta lecha sheva Shabbatot shanim, sheva pamim. This sounds like Sfirat HaOmer. It's very similar. You're going to count 7 cycles of 7 years, 7 times. You're going to get to 49 years, just like we have 7 weeks leading up to Shavuot, 49 days. Then it says, you should blow the shofar on the 7th month, that's Tishrei, on the 10th of the month, B'Yom HaKippurim, on Yom Kippur, Taviru shofar b'chol artzachem, blow the shofar. Now, what's the simple reading? You blow the shofar, and then you sanctify the 50th year, and you sanctify it from day number 10. Okay, and then it says all the laws of Shnat Shemitah, which are Kratem Dror Ba'aretz L'chol Yoshveha, Yovel Hitia Lechem, V'Shavtem Isha L'chuzato, V'Isha L'Mishpachto Tashuvu, right? All the slaves go free, all the land goes back to their original owner. And then it says, Yovel Hi, this is Yovel, Shnata Chamishim Shana Tia Lechem. It will be for you on the 50th year. Again, it seems a little repetitive. Lo tizra'u v'lo tiktzeru et tzvicha v'lo tivzeru et nesireha. Okay, don't plant, don't harvest, all that stuff. Okay, you can't do any of the harvesting, any of the normal work on the land, just like Shemitah. So first of all, if you say like the rabbis, that it really only starts on the 10th, there's this whole big debate. Does that mean people only go free on the 10th and the land only goes back on the 10th, but the fact that you can't work the land starts on day number 1? Or does really, the Rambam in Parashat Mishnah says, no, according to the rabbis, the Isur Malacha here, it's forbidden to work the land, also only kicks in on the 10th. So you end up with these 10 days where you could actually work the land. Because remember, you're back to back with the Shemitah year. The Shemitah year was the year before. It seems like you could work the land for 9 days, which would be a little bit strange. Or let's say minus Rosh Hashanah and minus Shabbat. But you would have this a little bit of space to do that. It's a little bit of a strange sheet. And most people think, no, he thinks even then, even though it starts on the 10th, really, you wouldn't be able to work the land either in the beginning of the year. And it's really referring to everyone going free. That's an aside. But now let's go back to the Gemara. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? It's Basara b'Tishrei, as it says in the verse. You sanctify the year after you blow the shofar. So Dichtiv, right, as it says, B'Yom Kippurim tabiu l'shofar, blow the shofar on Yom Kippur. So Mane, who does this go like? Rabbi Shmuel ben Osher, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broki. We already know the Gemara is going to say this because we had this already. Tanya, and now we're going to see. Here's his opinion. It comes up in a bright. He's going to prove it from the Psukim. It says, "B'kidashtem et shnata chamishim shana." Ma tamud lomar? Lefi shenemar b'Yom Kippurim yachol lo teh mitkadeshet ela miyom Kippurim va'elach. Why does it say sanctify the 50th year? It's obvious. You blow the shofar and then you'll sanctify it, right? So why do you need to say b'kidashtem et shnata chamishim? Seems unnecessary. So they say, Milame shemitkadeshet v'olechet mitchilata. As you could have just said, V'kidashim et hashana or something. You could have said it some other way. The fact that you said, Shnata chamishim, it seems to refer to the whole 50th year. So from here, you learn that it's actually really sanctified from the beginning of the year. Okay? From Rosh Hashanah. That's his proof. Now he describes. So then what's the idea of the shofar according to him? So what does he explain? Okay, this is, I think, what you're writing, Becky. You're writing based on what the Gemara is going to say right now. They don't yet leave their master's house, but they no longer work as slaves. They eat and drink and they're happy like free people at their owner's house. And they're wearing crowns on their heads. Okay, probably this doesn't mean literally. This sounds very much, if you remember the description, if you've heard this before, description of the tzaddikim in Olam Haba, they're going to sit with atrotehen al shehen. It's a way of really showing respect. These people will all of a sudden, slaves will turn into, they'll have all the glory. So what happens? Yom Kippur comes, they blow the shofar, and then okay, so basically, then they all go free. So the first 10 days are still part of the Yovel year, but they're sitting in this in-between stage. They're not slaves, but they're not yet free, and the land doesn't go back yet. Only when you blow the shofar, that's what the pasuk says. You blow the shofar, and then and then everyone goes free. That element is saved for the 10th day, but before that, this also Yovel. The Rabbanan, what do they do with this verse if they don't have it to teach what he just said? So they use this verse for something else. To teach you, means a very strange approach, and I'll tell you why. What this is saying is there's no mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh, which is something we're going to learn further on, and really it's given in the name of Chachamim, which is very weird. Commentaries say this is really a single person's opinion. This is not the main opinion, even though it's given in the name of the rabbis. That there's no mitzvah to determine the new moon every month. It's not a mitzvah, okay? We always say it's a mitzvah. You have to be Mekadesh the Chodesh. He says this pasuk is coming to teach you only years you have to sanctify and declare this is the Jubilee year. You don't need, and you do it on Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, but you don't need to do that on every month. Okay, we don't hold that way. We do have to do it every month. And that's why this pasuk is darshan like Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, that's coming to teach you this idea about the Yovel, that it starts from the beginning of the year. Tanya Idach, another Breita, and here we're only going to get to the first part of this Breita, which is okay, well, I just want to clarify one thing. You wrote the Sfardim do Kiddush HaChodesh. I assume you mean Birkat HaChodesh. That's not what we're talking about, Kiddush HaChodesh. Kiddush HaChodesh is in the time of when there was a Sanhedrin, they would determine this is Rosh Chodesh. We don't do that anymore. We don't have, right? We have a calendar now, a fixed calendar. But they said that even that maybe just determining the calendar when there's Rosh Chodesh, that's important to do. Okay? Not Birkat HaChodesh, which is, saying, oh, Rosh Chodesh will be a certain day. That's something different. Okay, so now we have another Breita. We're only going to see Rabbi Shmuel's opinion tomorrow. We'll see the rabbi's opinion, how they darshan it. Tanya Idach, Yovel he, that was the last verse I read, which is Yovel, which is Ma Talmud Lomar. Why does it say Yovel he? Seems redundant. Since it already said Kiddush Hashem, which we explain means what? It starts already before on Rosh Hashanah, even though it really starts on Yom Kippur and really we add more time. The same way we add 10 days in the beginning, you might have thought, and this sounds like Tosefet Shabbat, Tosefet Yom Kippurim, if you remember, we add all this stuff. Likewise, you sanctify things, maybe we would add an extra 10 days to the year. It would go from Rosh Hashanah to the Yom Kippur of the following year, maybe, right? That would be in terms of not planting, not working the land. The Al Titman, don't think this is a weird thing to think, because we know that we have times where we add sanctity to the mundane, right? So therefore, Talmud Lomar, that's why it says Yovel Shnat HaChamishim. That's why it says only the 50th year, no longer than that. Okay, and therefore, this is only a drasha according to Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai ben Broka, because according to the rabbis, you wouldn't even think that, because it's already not from the beginning of the year, so you wouldn't think it would extend beyond the year. It's already not even the whole year. There's no additional 10 days in the beginning, so you wouldn't think to add on days at the end. So we'll have to see what the rabbis do with Yovel Hi. We'll get to that tomorrow. Have a great day, everyone. Shavua Tov. We will meet up tomorrow.